Hey y'all, the Pacific Northwest weather is getting warm out, so I wanted to try and do my first epoxy project. Knowing this could go unbelievably bad, I was looking at what scrap wood I had and decided to try and make a picture frame art piece out of what I had lying around. The first thing I needed to do was to build out the picture frame from the scrap 1x2 pine boards and some maple plywood. For the outside frame, I needed to cut down the 1x2s, so I'm going to cut them to size with a handsaw, and then I'm going to begin cutting some box joints into the corners to help attach the frame together. To make the box joints, I'm going to do just a simple 3-finger box since these are pretty small corners. I'll do that by using the handsaw to carve down both sides, and then I'll do a third cut down the middle to make it easier for the chisel work. And then after marking our lines with the chisel on how deep I want to remove the material, I'll then chisel out the center area. Once I have that center area chiseled out, I then will mark it on the other board that I'll be connecting this one with so that I can get an exact transfer of where to chisel out that board. This board will get a similar starting point, and then I have to hand cut down the two sides. With this one, I want to keep the middle piece and remove the two side pieces. So once I cut through the top down, I then lay the board on side and hand cut out the other two pieces. And not a perfect match right off the bat, so a little trim up work is necessary to get this joint to fit together nicely as required. I do want the fingers to stick out some, and I can sand them down later to get them flat with the sides of the pieces. This is perfect for what I want. After cutting all the sides, I then need to do a glue up of the piece, and all 4 corners are glued, and then I clamp them together and then check for square. Now that that's dry, I need to create a recess in the sides to insert the back panel. To do that, I ran the circular saw down each side to create an initial outline for the groove for the panel to sit in. Then I went back through with the chisel to break out the leftover pieces that were not sawed out. This will create a recessed lip for the back piece to sit in. Now to measure out the back plate, I went ahead and taped the estimated area around the box where we'd be marking it out, and then we'll know where to cut the piece of plywood. A quick trim to get it down to size, and then we'll add a lot of glue in here. The frame itself is just a tad out of square, but the inserting of this backboard will help pull it in. It's got enough flex to be able to get there, but it does take a little persuasion to get back to square. I then clamp this down to make sure I get good glue adhesion all the way around, as the epoxy is going to be sitting on top of this, and I don't want any of that epoxy to leak out here through any cracks. While that was drying, I needed to cut out the cookies for the inside of the piece. For this, I had some apple logs sitting around that we had found a few months back, and so I looked for one that had some cool red markings on it that should show something interesting on the inside once we cut it open. As I kept cutting into this, you can just see that the pieces keep getting more and more interesting with the different red colors coming through here. Now these pieces are wet, about 25%, so I did go ahead and bake them for an hour at 170 degrees. Not really to dry them, though it did a little bit down to 20%-ish, but mainly to make sure the main cracks start to get pronounced so that we'll know where it's going to want to split in the future. That way I have those initial cracks in, and when we put in the resin, it will help fill those and keep those from growing. I did go ahead and chisel off the bark of the cookies as well to clean them up and make them look nicer in the frame. Once the back was dry, it was time to assemble with the cookies inside the frame. For this part, I noticed 2 of the cookies, when I put them together, made what looked like a heart shape. So I decided to make that the centerpiece of the piece. After cleaning up the sides on the miter saw, this is what it ended up looking like. And now to fill in the rest of the piece. Again, using a straight edge to mark lines, and then going over to the miter saw to cut them out so that they would lay flush against the border. I repeated that over and over again until the piece was full, using all the main pieces and offcuts to fill any of the large gaps. And once I got the shape I was looking for, I glued all of the pieces in place. I did add a clamp to a few areas that needed some help staying down. Once that dried overnight, I went ahead and did a rough sanding to make sure all the sharp edges were softened and anything I didn't want in the piece was taken out. And then it came time for the penetrating epoxy. I had never used it before, and I definitely used too much. After mixing it thoroughly, I went ahead and made sure that every single surface on here was covered. Not really knowing how the different pieces of wood would react between the end grains on the cookies, the 1x2s, and the maple plywood, I just went ahead and played it safe and covered everything, and made sure to brush it into all the cracks and crevices in the piece. I did lay down cardboard under it to try and catch anything that would drip out during the hardening overnight, and it's a good thing because some of it did try and escape. Not too much, but it did have an unfortunate place where I did epoxy some of the cardboard to the tabletop. I think this table will need a resurfacing soon. And now for the main pour. I switched it up a little bit and I used this Tyvek tape around the outside of the piece. I'm really mostly concerned about the corners, making sure nothing would seep out there. And then I essentially created its own little soft mold with this plastic and tape to make sure if anything did seep out from the sides or bottom, it would stay contained within this piece and not go spilling everywhere. I then mixed up the deep pour epoxy, and for this one I went with a light green color, semi-transparent, because I do have the maple plywood in the back, and I thought the green would be a good accent to the dark reds coming through the wood. So after mixing that up, I began to fill the piece, making sure all the corners and all the center sections were filled about halfway. And then after letting it sit for a while, I went through with a heat gun to make sure there were no bubbles hanging out. And then I filled it the rest of the way, making sure every crack and crevice got some epoxy into it. And one last run with the heat gun before it was ready to harden. Now I did let this sit for almost 10 days before I got back to it, and so opening up the plastic covering, you can see not much epoxy leaked through at all. That first penetrating epoxy really did seal it shut. Now this Tyvek tape was a different story. This did not come off easily, and so after trying to peel it off and getting many small chunks off, I ended up taking the belt sander to it to remove the rest of it. So at this point, I went ahead and cleaned up the sides, taking off any extra finger length from the box joints. And then I cleaned up the back of the piece to make sure there was no tape or any other residual epoxy left on the backside. Now the top you can see here, these pieces ended up sticking out about a ½ inch. And now I understand why people use router sleds and planers for this part, because this took forever to get this sanded down. I will say I took some artistic liberties here and really only focused on sanding the sides flat to the frame. I went ahead and left the inside parts of the cookies still protruding from the epoxy, and it gave kind of a cool 3D effect with the center pieces really poking out from the epoxy rather than it being just a flat piece, which I liked. So after lots of sanding, I went ahead and applied a round over to all the edges on the sides. And then took a fine grit sandpaper and sanded everything, including all of the epoxy to make sure it was all flat and smooth. Then I went with a simple spray-on polyurethane to coat the piece. I've never put this on epoxy, let alone green applewood, so we'll see how it goes. Worst case scenario, I'll be refinishing this in a year if it doesn't hold up. But after 2 coats, here's the final product. It really turned out nice. You can see the greens and the swirls through it, and you can still see just barely a hint of that maple plywood sticking through. The reds just really did come out great, especially in the center heart pieces that really show up nice. To hang it on my wall, I built a quick French cleat, and I put it on the back as well as a second block to help keep it floating away from the wall. So after you hang it up, it sits about a ½ inch off the wall and looks really nice. I do like the texture of the pieces sticking out from the epoxy, and the hard pieces that really are the star of the show really did turn out nice here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, be sure and like, comment, subscribe to see what I'm working on next. Thanks.